Please don't leave me. We are doing everything we can, but her condition is still very critical.
Bernice could no longer recognize herself. She lay beneath the white hospital sheets, her body so thin that every bone seemed visible beneath her skin. The woman who had walked down the aisle only months earlier, glowing in her wedding dress, had become almost unrecognizable. She could barely eat. Some days, even a few spoonfuls of soup made her sick. She was too weak to stand without help. And according to her doctor, she might not survive. That was why the doctor pulled her husband, Lee Soo-hyun, aside one evening. "Your wife doesn't need you to fix her," he said quietly. "She needs you to love her. She needs you beside her. If she doesn't make it, you don't want her final memories to be of an empty chair." Soo-hyun listened. Then he walked into Bernice's room. She looked at him and smiled weakly. "I knew you'd come." But he hadn't come to stay. He set a folder on the table beside her bed. Divorce papers. Then he placed his wedding ring on top of them and walked out. Bernice stared at the door until her eyes filled with tears. She couldn't follow him. She couldn't even stand. And she had no family in Korea. But that night, while Bernice lay believing she had been abandoned to die, the director of the hospital saw her for the first time. And what he did next would change everything. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. And if you want to see what happens to Bernice after the man she loved walks away, stay with us until the end. 3 months earlier, Bernice had entered her marriage believing she had finally found the person she would grow old with. She was beautiful, warm, intelligent, and full of life. When she married Lee Soo-hyun, she believed every promise he made her. He told her nothing would ever separate them. He told her he would stay through sickness and health. For the first few months, their marriage was everything she had hoped it would be. Then Bernice became sick. At first it seemed like ordinary exhaustion. She stopped finishing her meals. She began feeling weak. Then came the dizziness, the nausea, the constant fatigue, the days when simply getting out of bed felt impossible. Doctors began running tests. Bernice kept telling Soo-hyun she would get better. He kept telling her not to worry. But as the weeks became months, something terrifying happened. Bernice began losing weight rapidly. Her clothes became loose. Her cheeks disappeared. Her arms grew frighteningly thin. Her once healthy body slowly became little more than skin stretched over bone. She looked in the mirror one morning and barely recognized the woman staring back at her. She touched her face. Where did I go? She could barely eat. Sometimes she spent an entire day trying to finish a few spoonfuls of soup. She would lift the spoon to her mouth, take one bite, and immediately feel sick. Her body rejected almost everything. The doctors grew increasingly concerned. Bernice was hospitalized. The bed meant to be temporary became her home. She spent her days beneath white hospital sheets, connected to machines, too weak to walk without assistance. Sometimes she couldn't even sit upright for long. She watched nurses move around her while her own body seemed to be giving up, piece by piece. Soo-hyun began visiting less. At first, he stayed for hours, then minutes. Eventually, he started finding excuses not to come. Bernice noticed, but she still defended him. He has work. He is tired. He doesn't know what to say. She was terrified, admitting he was pulling away would make it real. One afternoon, her doctor examined her results and spoke privately with Soo-hyun. The doctor's expression was serious. Her condition is extremely fragile. Soo-hyun looked frightened. Will she recover? We don't know. The doctor paused. She may not even survive. The words seemed to drain the color from Soo-hyun's face. The doctor continued. Right now, she needs more than medication. She needs strength, emotional support, proper care, and someone beside her. If she believes she is fighting alone, that can make everything harder. Soo-hyun stared through the glass at Bernice. She was sleeping. Her face looked painfully thin. The wedding ring was still on her finger. The doctor placed a hand on Soo-hyun's shoulder. She needs to know that she is loved. She needs someone to tell her there is a reason to keep fighting. If the worst happens, you should be there to spend those moments with her. Soo-hyun said nothing. The doctor thought he was simply overwhelmed. He had no idea what Soo-hyun had already decided. The following morning, Soo-hyun came to Bernice's room carrying a folder. Bernice smiled weakly when she saw him. "You came?" He didn't smile back. He set the folder on the table beside her bed. Then he looked at the woman lying in the hospital sheets. "I can't do this anymore." Bernice stared at him. "What?" "I'm filing for divorce." Her lips parted. She looked toward the door, as though someone else might walk in and explain what she had just heard. "But I'm sick. I know. I need you." Soo-hyun looked away. "I don't know how to be your husband anymore." Bernice's eyes filled with tears. "Then just be here." It was almost a whisper. "You don't have to fix me. Just stay." But Soo-hyun couldn't. Or wouldn't. He took off his wedding ring and set it on top of the folder. Then he left the room. Bernice watched the door close. For several minutes, she didn't move. Then she slowly looked down at her own hand, at the ring still on her finger. Her fingers trembled. She began crying so quietly that the nurse standing outside couldn't hear her. She had spent months fighting to stay alive. And now the man she was fighting to return home to had decided there was no home left for her. The room felt different than it had an hour earlier. The same walls, the same machines humming quietly beside her bed. But something in the air had shifted. The way a house feels different the moment you learn someone important has left it for good. Somewhere outside her door, she could hear the ordinary sounds of the hospital continuing. A cart being wheeled past, nurses speaking quietly, footsteps that never once slowed near her room. No one stopped. No one asked if she was all right. She was simply a woman in a bed, in a wing full of other people's emergencies, invisible to everyone except the man who had just walked away from her. She reached for the folder, but her hand fell short and dropped back onto the sheets. She didn't have the strength to even open it. She didn't need to. She already knew what it would say. Bernice closed her eyes. For the first time since she'd been admitted, she let herself think the thought she had been avoiding for weeks. What if there was no one left to fight for? She didn't have an answer. She thought of her mother, thousands of miles away, still believing her daughter was simply getting stronger. She thought of the version of herself who had once believed marriage meant she would never face a hospital room alone. That woman felt like a stranger now. She only had the folder, his ring resting on top of it, and the quiet of a room that had just become a little emptier than it was that morning. Tonight, Bernice was simply trying to survive the hour in front of her. That night, long after the ward had gone quiet, a nurse stood outside Bernice's door, holding a tray of untouched food. "She hasn't eaten again?" A tall man in a dark coat paused beside her. It was Dr. Woosin, the hospital's director. He glanced through the glass. Bernice looked so thin that for a moment he thought he was looking at a much older woman. Then he watched her try to sit up. Her arms trembled. She failed and slowly lowered herself back onto the pillow. Woosin stopped walking. "Who is she?" The nurse told him. "American, married, severely ill. Husband had just divorced her that morning. No family nearby, no one beside her. Her husband divorced her? While she's still this sick?" The nurse nodded. Woosin said nothing. He simply stood there, looking through the glass at a woman the world had already decided to give up on. He had walked past hundreds of rooms like this one. He had signed off on countless files without a second glance. It was how the days worked when you carried the weight of a hospital on your shoulders. But something about this room made him stay a moment longer than he should have. "Send me her case file tonight," he said. The nurse hesitated. "She's under Dr. Han's team, sir." "Send it anyway." He didn't explain why. He only knew that somewhere behind that glass was a woman given up on twice in one day. Once by her husband, and almost by everyone else who simply hadn't noticed. Dr. Woosin decided he would not. The folder stayed on the table beside Bernice's bed for days. She couldn't bring herself to sign it. Not because she wanted Soo-hyun back, but because part of her couldn't understand how the same man who once kissed her forehead every morning could abandon her while doctors warned she might die. She stopped asking when he would visit. She already knew. He wasn't coming. Her mother called from America almost every day. "I'm okay, Mom," Bernice would say, trying to sound strong. But her voice was so weak that her mother knew she was lying. "Baby, come home." "I can't. We'll come to you. You shouldn't spend all that money. You're my daughter." Bernice began crying. "I don't want you to see me like this." That was the truth. She didn't want her mother to see how little was left of her. Her collarbones were prominent, her wrists were tiny, her face had lost the softness it once had. Even speaking could exhaust her. Eating remained a battle. A nurse would bring food. Bernice would stare at it, wanting to eat. But the moment she tried, nausea overwhelmed her. Sometimes she cried simply because she couldn't finish a bowl of soup. "Please," she whispered to her own body, "just let me keep something down." She became afraid of sleeping, afraid she might not wake up. At night, the hospital grew quiet, and she would lie awake remembering her wedding day. Her dress, Soo-hyun's smile, his hand around hers, the promises. Then she would look down at her skeletal body beneath the blanket and fail to reconcile the two versions of herself. One night, she whispered, "Was I only worth loving when I was healthy?" No one answered. But somewhere underneath that question, something else was beginning, so quietly she didn't notice it yet. If the answer was yes, she would have to find a reason to love herself that had nothing to do with him. Meanwhile, Woosin had begun reading through her file, night after night, in his office long after the hospital had gone dark. Weight loss charts, failed nutrition attempts, notes about a woman who kept apologizing for being sick. He noticed something the other doctors hadn't flagged. She wasn't just deteriorating physically, she had stopped fighting. The following afternoon, he walked into her room without an appointment, without a white coat, carrying nothing but her chart under his arm. Bernice was struggling with a few spoonfuls of soup, embarrassed to be seen failing at something so simple. "I know," she said before he could speak. Woosin frowned slightly. "Know what? I'm not eating enough. You don't have to apologize to me." "I'm trying." Her voice cracked. "I'm really trying." Woosin pulled a chair beside her bed. "I believe you." Those 3 words nearly destroyed her. Bernice turned away as tears slipped down her cheeks. No one had said that to her in weeks. He didn't ask about her husband. He didn't ask her to explain her marriage. He simply stayed until she finished what she could. Some days only 3 spoonfuls, other days 4, and treated every one of them like a victory. Word of Woosin's visits spread quietly through the ward. Nurses who had grown used to Bernice's silence began noticing small changes. A straighter posture when he was expected. A spoon lifted a little more steadily than the day before. None of them said anything to her directly, but they started leaving the door to her room open a little wider in the afternoons. One afternoon she asked, almost defensively, "Why do you keep coming back?" Woosin considered the question. "Because most people in this hospital walk past rooms like yours without stopping. Someone should stop." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have right now." She didn't push further, but long after he had gone, she found herself thinking about his answer, turning it over the way she used to turn over promises. She tried another spoonful the next morning, another sip, another breath, another small step towards simply staying alive. But recovery didn't move in a straight line. There were nights her fever spiked without warning, days she couldn't keep anything down, moments the medical team feared she was slipping backward instead of forward. On one of the worst nights, her fever climbed high enough that the nurses paged Woosin directly, even though he was off duty. He arrived within minutes, still in the clothes he'd been wearing at home, and stood at the foot of her bed while the team worked to bring her temperature down. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. Bernice, half-conscious, remembered afterward only the sound of his voice telling the nurses to move faster, and the strange comfort of knowing someone in the room wanted her to make it through the night. By morning, her fever had broken. Woosin was still there, asleep in the chair beside her bed, still in yesterday's clothes. Bernice, still weak, still uncertain whether she'd survive the week ahead, had no idea a man who barely knew her name had already decided she was worth fighting for. She only knew that for the first time since Soo-hyun walked out, someone had looked at her and said the words she needed most. "I believe you." The weeks that followed brought no dramatic transformation. Bernice's recovery moved in inches, not miles. But something had changed that the medical charts couldn't measure. She was no longer simply waiting to see what would happen to her. She had started, quietly, to fight, and for the first time, not for Soo-hyun, not for her mother, but because some small, stubborn part of her still wanted to see who she would become on the other side of this. Bernice didn't fully understand, at first, why the hospital director was suddenly paying this much attention to her file. Woosin continued visiting, though he never called it that. He would arrive under the excuse of reviewing her chart, or passing by, on his way to somewhere else. Bernice stopped believing the excuses after the second week. She never called him on it. She simply let him keep coming. One afternoon, as she picked at a plate of rice, she asked, "Don't you have a hospital to run?" "I do." "Then why are you here?" Woosin considered the question the way he considered most things. Slowly, without performing an answer he hadn't thought through. "Because this is part of running it." Bernice looked down at her plate. She didn't finish the rice that day. But she ate more than she had the day before, and Woosin noticed, without ever making her feel watched. Her body was still fragile. Her arms were thin enough that nurses winced slightly when drawing blood. Her hair had thinned. Her face had not yet recovered the fullness it once had. But there were mornings now when she woke and, for a few seconds before the exhaustion set back in, felt something close to normal. Those seconds were new. She held on to them. Her mother continued calling from America. The conversations grew slightly longer. Bernice still didn't tell her everything. She didn't mention Woosin, not because she was hiding him, but because she didn't yet have language for what he was to her. Then, 3 weeks in, everything nearly fell apart. It happened at night. Bernice woke gasping, her chest tight, unable to draw a full breath. She reached for the call button, but her hand shook too badly to find it right away. By the time nurses reached her, her oxygen levels had dropped dangerously low. A team was called. Machines were wheeled in. Woosin was paged immediately. He arrived faster than anyone expected, his usual composure visibly cracking at the edges. He stood outside the room while the team worked, watching through the glass the way he had that first night, except this time it wasn't a stranger losing her strength. He had seen death before, more times than he could count, but something about Bernice's case had quietly become different from the others. Not romantic, human. He remembered the woman who had once quietly asked someone, anyone, to simply stay. The minutes stretched unbearably. A nurse spoke numbers he understood too well, numbers he would have read with clinical distance in another patient's file. Here, they landed differently. Then, slowly, her oxygen levels began climbing back towards safety. Her breathing eased. The tightness in the room loosened, just slightly. Hours later, once she had stabilized, Woosin was finally let back into the room. Bernice was barely conscious, her eyes fluttering. "Did I?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Did I make it?" Woosin sat down beside her. "Yes." A faint, exhausted smile touched her lips. "I want to go home." Woosin understood immediately. She didn't mean her apartment, or America. She meant something simpler and harder to give. She wanted to feel like a person again instead of a patient. "You will," he told her. Bernice closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long while, she believed someone. In the days after the crisis, the hospital staff became more deliberate about Bernice's care. Physical therapy began working with her on sitting, standing, and eventually a few careful steps down the corridor. A nutrition specialist adjusted what she was being offered. The medical team stopped treating her case as a countdown. They were planning for recovery. The first time Bernice made it to the end of the corridor and back, her legs shook the entire way. But she stood there afterward, absorbing the fact that she had crossed that distance without being carried. She would remember that corridor for years. Woosin continued to oversee the case personally, but he kept a clear boundary. He spoke to her about test results, treatment plans, and the practical work ahead. When she thanked him, he usually redirected the conversation. "You don't owe me gratitude for doing my job." Bernice looked at him. "You could have left it to the team." "I did leave it to the team. I also happen to be responsible for making sure the team has what it needs." Her mother called that evening. "Your voice sounds different," she said. "Different how?" "Stronger." Bernice looked toward the window. "I think I'm getting better." Her mother went silent. Then came a shaky breath. "Say that again." "I think I'm getting better." This time, her mother cried. Bernice cried too, but neither of them tried to hide it. She still didn't tell her mother everything. The worst nights. The fear that had filled the room after Soo-hyun left. She simply said the doctors were hopeful. That was enough. There was a harder question waiting underneath the good news, one Bernice hadn't let herself ask until now. What she was actually recovering back into. Inside the hospital, there were nurses, doctors, monitors, and people who knew what to do when something went wrong. Outside, there would be none of that, and no husband waiting on the other side of the door. "Who will be with you when you leave?" Woosin asked her, reviewing the discharge plan. Bernice hesitated. "I don't know." It was the first question that made her recovery feel real. She contacted her mother again about having someone stay with her temporarily. Soo-hyun still did not call. Bernice noticed. She had stopped waiting for him to return. Across the city, Soo-hyun returned one evening to the apartment they had shared. Bernice's shoes were still near the door. A cardigan she'd worn the week before hung over the back of a chair. Her handwriting sat on a grocery list, still stuck to the refrigerator. He began moving things out of sight, telling himself he was cleaning. In reality, he was trying to erase a life he didn't want to examine too closely. When someone at work asked about his wife, he said simply that the marriage was over. He never mentioned that Bernice had been critically ill when he filed for divorce, or that a doctor had warned him she might die. He told himself the divorce had already been decided, and that revisiting it now would only prolong something that needed to end. One evening his phone rang. It was the hospital. He stared at the number until the call went silent, then read the message that followed. Bernice's condition had stabilized, and discharge planning had begun. For the first time in weeks, he wondered whether he should go. Then he thought of the folder he'd left on her table, and the ring he'd set on top of it. He put the phone down. Somewhere inside that silence, regret had quietly begun to take shape, though he still refused to name it. Across the city, Bernice was preparing to make a very different decision. She would not wait for Soo-hyun to come back. She would not build her recovery around whether he regretted leaving. She would leave the hospital because she wanted her life back. Not the life she'd had before the wedding, and not the one she'd imagined during it, but whatever came next, on her own terms. Woosin remained part of that process, but only as the man responsible for helping her reach that point safely. For now, Bernice's goal was simple. Get well. Go home. Start again. The morning Bernice was finally discharged, she stood in the hospital lobby holding a small bag of belongings. She was still thin, still weaker than she wanted to be, but she was standing on her own. The automatic doors opened, and sunlight spilled across the floor. Bernice stopped. For months, she had seen the outside world through hospital windows. Now it was directly in front of her. She took a slow breath, then she stepped outside. Woosin followed only as far as the entrance. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. "Keep following the plan." She smiled. "That sounds very much like a doctor's answer." "Because it is." She looked at the street ahead. For the first time in months, nobody was telling her what the next hour would look like. She would have to decide. Bernice turned back toward him. "I don't know what happens now." "Neither do I," Woosin said. "But you have time to find out." She nodded. Then she walked toward the waiting car. Woosin watched until she was safely inside before returning to the hospital. For Bernice, leaving the hospital was not the end of the story. It was the first morning of a life she had almost lost. And for Soohyun, the consequences of what he'd walked away from had not yet reached him. He still did not know how close Bernice had come to dying. He did not know who had stood beside her. He did not know how much she had changed. Bernice walked out of that hospital believing she had survived the worst thing that could ever happen to her. She was wrong. She had survived the illness. But she had not yet discovered who she was going to become, or who else might be waiting to find out. That story begins in part 2. If you want to see what happens next, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. And tell us in the comments, if you were Bernice, could you ever forgive the husband who walked away when you needed him most? Sometimes surviving is only the beginning. This time, she would face it on her terms.